Up next is Mary Jane McCallum, who's traveled from Manitoba to share a little bit with you about TB. So, thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Minnie and Miranda, for having me here, and to Sarah for inviting me, and all the other speakers. It's a real privilege to think through this history with you here. I think this is a fantastic idea and a great event. I'm so happy to be here. I am a history professor at the University of Winnipeg, and I look at the history of TB in the province of Manitoba. And so the history of Camsell obviously has a very unique history of its own. But there are also many similarities that are shared with other Indian hospitals and TB sanatoriums across Canada. And I shouldn't say even across Canada, because this is very much a kind of Western Canadian history, as Laurie mentions, if you include kind of northwestern Ontario in that Western history. So say in southern Ontario, we had a health center on the reserve, but for people who had TB, they mostly went to, and other kind of illnesses, they would go to kind of mainstream hospitals, as opposed to institutions run by the federal government. But I'm finding in Manitoba that there are a number of similarities, and one of them is that in all ways, the Department of Indian Affairs and later Health Canada, who ran Indian Health Services, always went for the kind of cheapest option for healthcare for Indigenous people, and that's kind of across Canada. In those institutions, the professional staff, doctors and nurses, tended to be non-Indigenous people. The support staff, cooks, aides, orderlies, and cleaners tended to be, or could be, Indigenous people. So those with the most decision-making power were non-Indigenous people. And this led to a situation where, those making decisions could be very uninformed about, importantly, the history of Canada, the history of our places. From Indigenous perspectives, was not well known, right? So this led to a situation where they could fall back on, let's say, prevalent stereotypes in Canadian society that were prevalent in the media and prevalent probably in post-secondary education where they did their training. One of those was that ill health for Indigenous people in Canada was largely the fault of Indigenous people. And another stereotype was that to fully recover, Indigenous people needed not simply biomedical assistance, they also needed assimilation. That was necessitated as well. So I'm finding that there's these similarities. So I'll tell you a little bit about my research in Manitoba. So basically there's three branches to the project. I look at surveys, I look at hospitals, and I look at rehabilitation programs. And this really follows the records that I'm looking at. Manitoba is distinct in that in our province, Indian sanatoriums were run by the Sanatorium Board of Manitoba on behalf of the federal government. So the records, and we talked a little bit about records so far, they went directly to the San Board as opposed to the National Archives. So it's been a little bit trickier to get a hold of them. But as has already been brought up, these records are already quite patchy, so you kind of go with what you can find. So the first surveys happened in the late 1930s in Manitoba, and then they expand in the 40s and the 1950s, and there's this really strong history of X-ray surveys in Manitoba, and it's connected to a kind of myth of the control over TB and the celebration largely of the Sanatorium Board of Manitoba and white doctors in the province. So finding alternative histories is really important, and it's something that we're kind of coming to now. Let me see here. Okay, here's another photograph of the X-rays. The X-ray surveys went around largely in the summertime in Manitoba, and they followed the treaty parties. And they did this in a kind of coercive way to ensure that people would show up for the X-ray. So you do your X-ray first, and then you get your treaty. These are two what we might say desegregated or non-Indian hospitals. But the one on the far right is a kind of showcase TB sanatorium for Manitoba, and it largely catered to non-Indigenous people up until the 1950s, when the disease came under control among the white population. Those beds opened up and a number of Indigenous people went to Ninette. The St. Boniface Sanatorium as well was a non-Indigenous hospital, but there was a pavilion, a special pavilion for Indian patients. Also, Métis patients and Inuit patients went to these facilities, especially starting kind of in the 1950s and 60s. These are the 3 segregated TB sanatoriums in Manitoba. Jennifer was the first one to open in 1940. This was seen as the big opportunity for the federal government to get involved in TB treatment for Indigenous people. It was an old hospital, and it had no surgery, so it was largely seen as a place to go for people who had who couldn't be saved for TB, so had very high death rates in the early years. The other 2 hospitals were they were military hospitals before. They may look kind of a bit like military hospitals to you. This was a trend in the Department of Indian Affairs and later Health Canada to purchase old buildings as opposed to build new buildings for Indian hospitals. And so this happened in Manitoba too. Those hospitals closed in the 1960s, and some of the patients get moved around, including to Camsell Hospital. So we do have that kind of connection and similarity in our histories as well. I'm very interested in the rehabilitation programs, and this is kind of what connected Sarah and I. I look particularly at the education and the labor programs that were run in the hospitals. And the ones in Manitoba drew significantly from the program that was at Charles Camsell, which was very influential and very important across Canada. There's a field of rehabilitation called Indian rehabilitation, in fact. And this was, this had to do with this notion that for full recovery, Indigenous people would probably have to make not only a kind of lifestyle change that would help to keep the TB under control, but also sort of move to the south and engage in full-time employment, largely in urban areas. And here's the unit, rehab unit at Brandon Hospital. And this was a kind of experiment that was run in the hospital to encourage people who had recovered from TB to kind of stay a bit longer, do some upgrading, and then receive counseling. This was largely like social counseling, I guess, citizenship training, and then go out to find a job. And this rehabilitation program was seen as so successful that one of the doctors said that, you know, First Nations people were actually kind of lucky to get TB because it gave them this opportunity to kind of improve themselves and find employment. So it's the ill wind that blows good. Yeah, and that's all. Thank you very much.